Now, I'm not someone putting forward some argument for religion or God or anything like that. I would describe myself as an atheist. But I see a question. And the question starts very simply, which is, if the world, as described by science, really is all there is, what kind of a fact is the fact that I exist? I talked about this in my first video. Why am I here? It doesn't seem to be a fact describable by science. Of course, you can reduce it to, into scientific terms. But that isn't the same thing at all, because that's kind of avoiding the question. Well, I'm going to take a couple of steps back, because the question really gets interesting is with Kant. Kant took on board Berkeley's thought that the very idea of space as a thing in itself is nonsensical. He talks about this in the first part of the Critique of Pure Reason, the Transcendental Aesthetic. Space is not a thing in itself. Space is just the way we see things. It's a necessary form of outer appearances, as Kant says. And he goes a step further in his eyes, a very important step further than Berkeley, in recognizing that experience couldn't take any other form. If experience wasn't as of objects in space, then there would be no sense to the idea of personal identity, because personal identity requires that I trace a path through space and time. And this is in Kant's argument, the refutation of idealism, in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, which comes after the Transcendental Aesthetic. But in a sense, it's also, in a way, comes before, because you've got to understand why Kant thinks he's entitled to say what he says. So if experience takes a necessary spatial form, that space is not a thing in itself, then what is ultimately real? And Kant said, there's something else, some other aspect to reality, the way things are in themselves, which he called the noumenal world, as opposed to the phenomenal world. And recent commentators, and a typical example would be P.F. Strawson in The Bounds of Sense, an analytic philosopher, have said, well, this is where Kant goes wrong. He should really get rid of ditch his theory of noumena. His theory of reality is far better, if he just sticks to the first part, the phenomenal part. But the problem is that it makes no sense to take noumena away from Kant's theory, because he's just said the very thing that rejects the idea of a mundane world, as I talked about it earlier, the world of science being the ultimate reality. Space is not a thing in itself. It's only a form of experience. So if you then ask Kant, well, okay, so there's something else, what is it? He can't say. He says, it's unknowable. So reality is unknowable. That's a mind-blowing thought. Here I am in the world, and yet there is something which is true, if you can use the word true, about this, all this, my experience, everything, the world and everything, that cannot be known. Not just that it's, it requires beings who are far cleverer than we are or anything like that. It cannot be known. And if you're not going to go the God route, which doesn't help anyway, because Kant himself said, there's no way to know anything about God. You can't prove God's existence. We're left with this bewildering paradox that we don't know the world that we live in. We don't know what it is. And I kind of feel that way. I'm not an idealist, and I don't accept Kant's view about the phenomenal and noumenal worlds. And yet it seems to me that there are questions that science cannot answer. Fundamental questions about the most basic facts of existence as they present themselves to me or to you or to whoever. And these are real questions, they're not pseudo questions, and there doesn't seem to be any way to answer them, which is mind-blowing. And I've spent my, well, philosophical career, for want of a better word, in pursuit of this. I wrote a book, which I've mentioned before, I'm not going to talk about it again, in which I argued that we had to accept the truth of a contradiction, which is a position that nobody wants to accept. And I don't really accept it myself. It was just, I was saying, you know, this is what we've got to say. What do you do when you are in pursuit of reality? When religion doesn't satisfy you, when science doesn't satisfy you. My daughter gave me a very good metaphor for this. It's like being in a corridor, and on one side is the door of science, and the other side is the door of religion. And there's no way out of the corridor, no stairs up or down. Where do you go? I guess the answer is you make YouTube videos.